Hello, Bill.
Hello, Matt.
Good to see you.
How was Southern DMZ today?
Things are great. Nice hat.
Thank you. For folks who wonder, it's I think I have to forgo showering for about maybe 4 days. At that point, I have to wear a hat when I'm on camera.
I think you look cool, and although I do miss the beard, I mean, you've trimmed it since a couple episodes ago when it was like sort of almost like a Jim Morrison latter day Jim Morrison.
I was thinking more Rutherford B. Hayes.
Well, speaking of Rutherford B. Hayes, Bill, nice segue to presidents. And we've talked about Northampton, Massachusetts, where the northern DMZ resides, where you are right now. And a lot of people don't know home of Jonathan Edwards. And also...
by Jonathan Edwards, you mean not presidential candidate...
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Notorious philanderer John Edwards. You mean the historic Reverend Jonathan Edwards.
Absolutely. And not only that, but home to the Calvin Coolidge Museum. And, Bill, I'm going to hold up this book called Coolidge by Amity Schlaze. I'm supposed to interview her for my podcast on Thursday about this book. And I was listening to, in preparation, I was listening to her talk about it on all these other shows like Q&A, C-SPAN Q&A. And I learned about this connection to Northern DMZ. But Bill, tell us, it must be awesome to live in the shadow of such a great president.
I do like living in the shadow of a president, so I'll agree with you up to that point. And I have been meaning to read up more about Coolidge history because I've been sort of getting up on my presidential history pre-Coolidge. I'm actually sort of doing it in part to lead up to Coolidge and sort of get a proper historical framework, because there is a conservative narrative about Coolidge that I think Reagan initially brought back. Reagan hung a picture of Coolidge in the White House and tried to sort of restore his luster and not have him be seen as the cause of the Great Depression. And I assume, I haven't read the Schlale's book yet, but I assume she's trying to extend that point. And this is an extension of what she wrote in The Forgotten Man, which was trying to pillory FDR. As the FDR did not save us from the Depression, he extended the Depression, and Hoover was a progressive Republican, and FDR essentially was an extension of Hooverism. But Coolidge was the guy who had this awesome economy in the 20s, and really isn't the fault of anything that happened with the Depression. I assume that's where she's going with the book. I think
you're on to something there, Bill. But let me ask you just about Northampton. What's it like? How big of a deal is Calvin Coolidge there, and what do we know? Like, I know that the library's there. I think he was a mayor of it or something. But
he was born in Vermont, but he was he was a lawyer in Northampton. He became mayor of Northampton. At a time when being a mayor was kind of a part-time gig, but it still catapulted him into the governor's seat of Massachusetts, and actually it was when he was governor, I believe it was 1919 or thereabouts, when he famously broke the Boston police strike.
Right. Oh, it's sort of like almost like Reagan and Patco many years later. Very similar situation, and it also helped propel him to be the governor, right?
Well, no, he was already governor.
He was the governor. Helped propel him to the presidency.
He was the governor. He broke the Boston police strike. He's sort of very I forget the exact pithy quote. He was silent Cal. He was always very pithy. Essentially, there's no reason ever to jeopardize the public safety. He's just sort of dismissed the whole concept of a police strike, in one sentence. And my understanding is that there had been a lot of labor unrest up to that point. The Wilson administration was a very active administration, and there was, I think, a sense of exasperation that had been kind of building up, and Coolidge kind of punctured it. And so that gave him that catapulted him into the vice presidency under Harding. Harding ran on the platform, the return to normalcy, and also sort of swipe at Wilson's activity. And then Harding died, and Coolidge became president for the bulk of the 20s. So he's known, of course, as being a classically conservative light regulation, low tax conservative. I am sort of curious, and not knowing the history as well as I would like. The Republican Party for a long time was really split into progressive and conservative camps, and which Teddy Roosevelt had exposed in his third party run in 1916. And so I'm sort of curious, how conservative was Coolidge really? What are some of the more progressive aspects of his record? I know Dukakis actually gave a lecture not too long ago highlighting the progressive parts of his record. So I'm sort of curious about the full Coolidge story.
He was pro-tariff, which is
he was
pro-tariff. He supported
tariffs.
tariffs.
Are you still on the phone?
He supported tariffs, which is not.
Oh, right.
That's not.
The
not
tariff was
the free trade, free marketers.
Well, if anything, was fundamental to republicanism for decades. Going into the latter half of the 19th century. Through I don't know where Eisenhower was on tariffs, but the tariff was sort of the ideological glue of the party. It's what separated them from the Democrats. So that's not surprising that Coolidge was pro-tariff, because that's where their bread and butter was in many respects.
Well, and but if you read Schle's Forgotten Man, she sees Hoover as a big government Republican who helped cause, and the Smoot-Hawley tariff would be one of the things I think that she would say helped cause or worsen the Great Depression. And so this would be an area where Coolidge would have been out of step with today's sort of free trade, free market brand of conservatism. Otherwise, I think he would be his political philosophy would match pretty well with today's orthodoxy of free market economics.
Well, so just go back to the original point, made the less interesting subject of his Northampton connection. He is remembered here. There's a bust of Coolidge downtown. The Coolidge Library and Museum is here, though it's pretty small. The bridge that links Northampton to Hadley is the Calvin Coolidge Bridge. The big theater in town is the Calvin. So there's lots of the Calvin.
I like that.
His funeral happened, literally on the street that I live on, which Eleanor Roosevelt had attended. There's a plaque on the house that he lived in while he was president, which is actually a very modest house, and it fit his reputation of being sort of one of the most frugal people around. Although he, after his presidency, retired to this very modest house, and the traffic around his front porch was too much. It was tying up traffic amongst his neighbors, and so he figured he just wasn't tenable. And he then bought a bigger, more mansion's probably overdoing it, but it's behind a gate. It's a little more on the outskirts, and you have to get past the gate to go down this long driveway to get to the house. It has a name. It's called the Beaches, but it's in private hands. There's a family that lives in it now, and so there's little plaques about that sort of stuff.
Well, let me say, Bill, you've extended invitations for my family to visit the North.
Always.
And we have typically rebuffed those because we only go to the Hamptons. But now the south of France as well. But now that I see the Jonathan Edwards and the Calvin Coolidge connection, this is almost like a trip to Mecca for us. We may have to go pay homage in your small little.
Well, there's no better time to come than March, which is Sugar Shack season. The maple sap is running.
Right. I forgot about that. All right. So anyway, the book is Coolidge. I'll be interviewing Amity Schleys, the author, on.
Is Schleys? That's the proper way to pronounce it?
I think so. It's actually, you know what? Shales sounds so good, but it's actually spelled Shlaes. I think it's Schleys.
Well, I'm curious if you could throw out a question for me.
Yeah, what should I ask her?
Ask her. since this was a time when the Republican Party had, this is where both parties were not ideologically pure. They both had progressive and conservative elements. It wasn't really until FDR where he sort of began the process of ideological purification. Ask her what were the progressive elements of the Coolidge record. I'm curious what her take is on that, because there obviously were some.
Yeah, and he came up. I mean, he came up before he was president. He was part of, he always had to be sort of part of a machine or something. And so I'm sure that there were occasions when he was part of progressive, even if it wasn't when he was president, because of the Republican Party. So at some point, I'm sure that there's some stories.
So I look forward to that interview.
Yeah.
Now. The other, I think, one of the interesting happenings in conservative land this week was this shot across the bow of the SS Limbaugh from S.E. Cupp, who's one of your young Turks, has a perch on MSNBC, has a regular column, and she's sort of making her stand to say, look, we don't have to cower in the shadow of Rush Limbaugh as conservatives. When Rush Limbaugh says something stupid and offensive, it's incumbent upon conservatives to call him out, and that does not mean you're a bad conservative when you do that. And she seemed to sort of take umbrage at people. I guess she must have said this on MSNBC.
No,
she responded more fully.
No, it actually came from, I think I was the first person to spot this. There was a very good, very extensive piece in the New York Times Magazine.
Right.
That was about young tech Republicans, and Kristen Soltis Anderson was quoted, and lots of other young, up-and-coming conservatives were quoted. And S.E. Cupp was quoted, we can't be afraid to call out Rush Limbaugh. And then she goes on to say something that I think might have been even more concerning to some. She says, if we can get 3 Republicans on 3 different networks saying what Rush Limbaugh said is crazy and stupid and dangerous, maybe that'll give other Republicans cover. So it's almost like a conspiring thing. I mean, you could say it could be organic.
And as an example, she gives, she was complaining that she got a lot of hostile comments on Twitter. How dare you say that Rush Limbaugh says crazy things? Give me one example, and she says, "I'm happy to give an example of calling Sandra Fluke a slut." If that wasn't the epitome of crazy, stupid, dangerous, allow me to explain the obvious. It was crazy because it invented an irrational connection between her private sex life and her political position. It was stupid because calling someone a knave is intellectually lazy. Make an actual argument. And it was dangerous because it trafficked some of the same kind of misogyny that liberals use when they blast conservative women for being sluts, prove sexually repressed. I'm less impressed by the latter argument, but nevertheless, she was very defiant in making a case to say, I'm not a bad conservative by demanding some basic sanity and decency and intellectual standards in communicating conservatism. And I wonder, Matt, to what extent has she hit a nerve where a lot of conservatives saying, thank you, Rush is really dragging us down here. He should not be the face of conservatism. Or to what extent is she an outlier and she's going to get crushed by all the ditto heads that are out there?
It's interesting. There's a quote from Yeats, a poem that says something like, I'll misquote it, but something to the effect of, the best keep silent while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Paraphrasing, but the point is, this is sort of true. Like, the people that you hear from, if you're S.E. Cupp, well, here's what happens. People who agree with you email you and say, hey, S.E., between you and me, I think you're right. The people who disagree with you shout it from the rooftops, and they harass you on Twitter. So I have no doubt that, and this is the same phenomenon that is why people complain at restaurants, and that no one ever tells the manager what a great job, what a great service they got. You only hear the negative. I admire SC, whether or not you agree with her on this. the fact that she doubled down and wrote, after the, days later after this quote coming out in the New York Times, and wrote a column, I think displays courage. It's the pushback, I'm sure, was immense. In terms of actually, do I agree with her or not? It's somewhat nuanced. On one hand, I actually really do have a lot of respect and reverence for Rush Limbaugh. I mean, I've been a fan of Rush since probably 1988. And I think he's done a tremendous amount of good. And I think he was in many ways a voice in the wilderness. By the same token, I think that what's happened is the media environment has changed. And so it used to be that Rush would say something on the radio that was like funny, irreverent, maybe off color. And his audience sort of knew they were in on the joke and they would laugh at it. And he would then preach to the choir and inspire them. Well, today, other people are listening. And they're hoping to take something he says and to use it against conservatism and against the Republican Party. And too often, I think he has been, that's happened. And it's unclear to me whether or not he wants that to happen. He certainly gets publicity when that happens. But in any event...
He likes talking about when that happens.
Yeah, and even in any event, the problem is that for him to be... to do his thing, he needs to be able to be, satirical and controversial and all those things. That's what he needs to do to stay at the top of the talk radio world. But unfortunately for him, the media has evolved where people are listening, they're taking it out of context, they're using it against him, and they're not sort of laughing it off. I mean, if you listen to Rush for 3 hours, he might say, and I mean, this is completely, having listened to him for years, I'm paraphrasing here, and I don't know that this happened, but he might say, Sandra Fluke is a slut. And then he might come back during the break and be like, look, you can call her what you will. I'm sure she's a fine young lady. But so, in other words, it doesn't necessarily excuse the other stuff, but it's a little more nuanced, and then he maybe would expound on how he actually has a philosophical difference with her paying for, prophylactics, whatever, contraception. But that's lost on the soundbite. Now, the problem that S.E. Cupp is going to have is that she works at MSNBC. And whether she's right or not, or has a point or not, it's going to be perceived that she's just like Joe Scarborough. Oh, she's like a sellout, and that we can't trust her anymore. And there certainly are people saying that.
And she tried to address that, saying she's merely defending conservatism in hostile territory, which I'm sure is part true, and also ignores being able to collect a paycheck. And that's I don't begrudge her making a living doing what she's doing, because obviously I tried to do the same thing.
Well, and there's people, there are conservatives, I mean, that I've talked to who say things like this. They say they don't think she's doing this because it's a conscious effort to like make friends with her bosses at MSNBC. But it's one of those things, like, if you're on a show every day and there's 3 liberals against you and you live in New York City and everyone you meet is liberal, then eventually you're going to see that's going to change your health and shalom. Well,
it's also, she's not going to lose her salary by doing it.
What's that?
She's not going to lose her salary taking a pot shot like that. Maybe if she was on Fox and she was doing that thing with regularity, maybe Roger Ailes would say, you know what, you're not the right fit for our network.
Oh, well, I think that's a pretty good point. That rings somewhat true.
I don't think that means she is making up what she is saying. I mean, I think she would have her slot regardless of whether she took that tack or not. But I think it frees her up to highlight the parts of her thinking that are a little more out of the box.
Right.
And so, what I'm sort of curious about is, I mean, as I said before, I listen to Rush more often now since Obama re-election than I have in a long time, because I enjoy I enjoy watching the suffering. And
Schadenfreude.
Yeah, I was going to say that, but I knew I was going to mispronounce it.
And today's the show for big words, Bill. I'm going to toss out all these. I may not be pronouncing them right either. I don't know. I'm a writer. That's the problem with being a writer. Sometimes you write these things and you don't know how to pronounce them. So hopefully I'm right.
But when I listen to the show, he just feels old to me. He feels like an angry old man. And
you tried doing anything for 25 years.
Well, that could be just it. You run out of gas and you lean on. I mean, he literally was playing whitewater clips when Hillary was testifying on Benghazi recently. Playing the old favorites to the fans, and it just felt so stale to me.
The Rolling Stones are still doing concerts, but I'm sure it's not like 1968. You know what I mean? It's
right.
How do you stay on top forever? It's impossible.
And I feel the same way about Bill O'Reilly. I feel the Fox News demographic is very skewed to 60 and up, and I just wonder, are younger conservatives more like S.E. Cupp and just don't connect with Rush's style, the kind of loose racial talk that he does, that kind of misogynistic stuff that S.E. Cupp was railing against? Is that just not how modern conservatives act, or do modern conservatives still revel in that stuff because they cherish the politically incorrect nature of it all?
I think it's a combination of both. I think that S.E. There's sort of two conflicting issues right here. On one hand, there are conservatives who say, the real enemy is Obama. Why are you attacking Rush Limbaugh? This man has done so much for the conservative cause over the years. Why aren't you worried about Benghazi or Obama? Why are you wasting your time attacking with these internecine struggles? Why would you attack Rush? He's on our team. And what about Reagan's 11th commandment? On the other hand, you have people, I think, like Cupp, who say, we need to examine our own house, and we need to make some changes, and we need to rethink some things. And the things that used to work may not work anymore. And we shouldn't have any sacred cows. And even though I respect Rush, nobody should be above the law or above criticism or skepticism. And when Rush says something harmful, we should call him out for it. I think there's a real, almost substantive disagreement here that really speaks to should conservatives circle the wagons and focus all their energy on attacking the left, or should there be a time of introspection and soul-searching and maybe even cleansing? And that's really the fundamental question. S.E. is obviously a lot younger than Rush, and I do think she represents at least a significant portion of the new right. She's an atheist, and as I've written about recently, and I think it's kind of an unfortunate thing, but I think that the conservative movement has become more secular and, as Ross Douthat said, more likely to channel Ayn Rand and Thomas Aquinas. So,
well, that brings up something that you wrote about recently.
What a segue!
Because Douthat had a column called "The End of a Catholic Moment," talking about the political significance of Pope Benedict stepping down, and suggesting that in Pope John Paul's time, the decade, the 2000s, he says, mid-2000s were the last time the Catholic vision of the good society, more egalitarian. See, I can't pronounce big words.
Egalitarian, Bill.
Egalitarian American conservatism.
That happens to me sometimes. I don't. Sometimes, like even words, like really little words, I just can't. I don't. It's bizarre. It happens. It happens. It happens.
More egalitarian than American conservatism and more moralistic than American liberalism, enjoyed real influence in U.S. politics. At the time of John Paul's death, the Republican Party's agenda was still stamped by George W. Bush's compassionate conservatism, which offered a right-of-center approach to Catholic ideas about social justice. The Democratic Party, meanwhile, was looking for ways to woo the values voters, many of them Catholic, who had just helped Bush win re-election. And prominent Democrats are calling for a friendlier attitude towards religion and a bigger tent on social issues. That was 8 long years ago. Since then, the sex abuse scandals that shadowed John Paul's last years have become the defining story of his successor's papacy. And to what you just quoted, whereas 8 years ago, the Catholic view of economics and culture represented the center that both parties hope to claim. Today's Republicans are more likely to channel Ayn Rand than Thomas Aquinas, and Australian social liberalism holds the whip hand of the Democratic Party. There's a lot there that I don't necessarily agree with. I guess first and foremost, I never looked at the 2000s from a Catholic prism. I mean, I'm aware that both parties were looking at the Catholic vote as a swing vote,
right?
Well, but I really didn't look at the Catholic Church and Catholic social thought as being the driving force that shaped these policy positions. But this is sort of Duke that's beat, not mine. I
think he's right.
What was your response to all this?
Well, I think he's right. George W. Bush is not Catholic, but in many ways he is Catholic. It's like Bill Clinton being the first black president. George W. Bush could have been, how many? JFK was the first Catholic.
Just JFK, that's it.
He could be the second Catholic president. In fact, I've heard that he might even convert. George W. Bush, most of his speech writers were Catholic. And then even people like Michael Gerson, who's an evangelical, is a very sort of Catholic evangelical, which is a weird thing for me to say, but I could just take my word for it. It's true. Some of it has to do with words. So like when George W. Bush talks about, he would always talk about a culture of life. That is a Catholic dog whistle or code language.
Well, I mean, that was literally taken from a Pope John Paul statement, correct?
I think so. It's certainly not the kind of terminology that Pentecostals used to use. They probably do now because, it just becomes part of the culture, part of the language. But a culture of life. So much of what Bush, the way he framed issues, the compassionate conservatism, I think, is very much a Catholic thing.
Also, the cultural ethic always struck me as odd because, I mean, it was lifted from Pope John Paul. It clearly was, I think it was a dog whistle to the Catholic vote, but also a way to bridge some of the long-standing gaps in Catholicism and evangelical Christianity. But when that was said, it was meant to encompass the full Catholic view of life, anti-abortion, anti-contraception, anti-death penalty, anti-war. And, Bush used it in a way that only took half of that. He never really embraced the whole concept as it was initially articulated.
Okay, well, there may be some truth to that. Also, he obviously used it for talking about, like, embryonic stem cell research and stuff like that. I guess your point, and it very well may be appropriate, is that he didn't embrace all the Catholic tenets. But I would say certainly sort of Catholicism was very much a large part of his language, of his political philosophy. And I think that the whole notion of compassionate conservatism was a sort of a Catholic thing. And I think, now Douthit talks about this phenomenon on the right and the left, but I chose to zero in on the right, because that's what I'm more interested in. And I think, frankly, since this trend has changed, the movement away from Catholicism, it's the Republican Party that has suffered and conservatism that has suffered. And I think, when he talks about channeling Ayn Rand, I mean, this is something that I've seen. I believe that, my take is that, before Reagan there were two sort of influxes of new conservatives. You had the neocons, who were mostly Jewish, some Catholic, but mostly Jewish intellectuals, who brought a sort of intellectual heft to conservatism and a sort of moral cause, to it. And you had evangelicals, the Christian right, who, if the Jewish conservatives and the Catholic neocons were the intellectual addition to conservatism during that era, sort of in the late 60s, then, a decade later, in sort of the late 70s, the ground troops arrived, the Christian right, the people the activists in the Christian coalition. But they were all sort of advocating a certain morality in politics. I think that post-Reagan, there have been two additional times when there was a large influx of kind of new believers into conservatism. And I think that it happened after 9/11, when you had a lot of people who, they weren't really conservatives, they were just anti-terrorists, and they thought, the left wasn't handling the war on terror with enough seriousness. They joined the movement. And then I would say around Obama's election in 2008 and the economic collapse and the stimulus, you had like the Tea Party movement arise. And again, this is an influx of new people who aren't necessarily, Burkean or whatever. I mean, they're not, just because you're anti-terrorist or anti-Obama doesn't mean that you are a conservative. But in many ways, these new immigrants to the conservative movement have kind of taken over. And it's almost like a mirror of what happens in a society. You always need new people, and you need new ideas, and you need people coming in, but you also need them to assimilate. And ironically, it's conservatives who worry about immigration, but I feel like the ideological immigrants into conservatism have not assimilated in some cases. And so you have, I think Douthit was absolutely right, you have this shift where modern-day conservatism is more like Ayn Rand than it used to be. And I think that...
But you still question whether this is really tied to shifts in Catholicism.
Well, I think that as Douthit says 8 years ago, Catholicism loomed large over the conservative movement. And even if you weren't a Catholic, the sort of ethos of a culture of life and of compassionate conservatism sort of was a big element of conservatism. And I think that because of Bush's spending, because of the the wars in Iraq, the military adventurism, the spending, and the economic collapse, there's been an overreaction, a backlash against compassionate conservatism. And we've almost gone to another extreme, which is a much harder-edged, rugged individualist, anti-communitarian brand of conservatism, which I think turns off a lot of voters, including Hispanics, I think.
I mean, I agree with all that. I question Douthit's, Catholic worldview in all this. I mean, and this I think is the big argument against that. Paul Ryan. I mean, Paul Ryan, who's, let's face it, Mr. Ayn Rand, although he always has tried to, in recent years, try to sort of distance his ties to her, but I mean, there's plenty of evidence that he's very shaped by her views. He not only is Catholic, but Romney, gave the Catholic hard sell for him. I mean, every appearance that he had with him in the initial introduction, they would bring up the fact he was Catholic, and obviously Romney was not saying the same thing about his own faith, in his introductions. There still was a basic belief that the Catholic vote is a swing vote, which I think is an oversimplification, but the party still believed it. And they felt they had to juice up the Catholic vote if they were going to win some of these key swing states. So that didn't change despite the passing of John Paul and the pedophile scandals and the like. What you're talking about, the shifts away from the rejection of compassionate conservatism, is more tied to the failure of Bush. anything to do with the state of religion in this country, I think.
Well, that's where Douthat and I disagree. I mean, we both agree that this trend has happened. He blames the failure, the scandals in the Catholic Church. I blame culture, and that politics is downstream from culture, and eventually, if culture changes, politics will change, and even conservatism itself eventually will mirror. It's this thing called, I'm trying to think of the name of it. What's escaped me now? But my essential point is that even conservatism itself, to some degree or another, reflects the society. And as our society has become more secular and coarser, conservatism has had to move that direction. It's called the Overton window. That's what I was confusing. Has had to move in that direction to stay relevant. I mean, it's my theory, and we'll see how things change. Now, I do have to say, like everything else, this is more complex than we make it out to be. I mean, it's a very nuanced thing. We know that a lot of Tea Party members also call themselves Christians. I'm not saying that overnight everybody became an Ayn Rand, individualist, selfish atheist. I mean, obviously that's simplistic. But I'm saying that this is a matter of emphasis. And a decade ago, there was an emphasis on a certain brand of conservatism, which has by and large fallen out of favor. And now there's an emphasis on rugged individualism. All of these things, these elements have always been part of the conservative coalition. But it's a matter of emphasis, and I think that the emphasis has shifted from being a sort of compassionate, communitarian brand of conservatism to being a tougher, more selfish, more stingy brand of conservatism. Now, interestingly, Ed Morrissey has a column in The Week which explains, I think helps fill in the gaps as to why this happened. And he argues that because our politicians spent us into oblivion, that the natural reaction is for the right to become stingier and to go this direction. But it's because our politicians weren't honest with us, and that, if they had been more responsible, then we could have a social safety net, and everyone will be okay with that, but that the backlash, the Tea Party backlash, was a result of politicians spending. And look, I think you have to put Bush in there with Obama and everybody else if that's the case.
Now, we talked about this a little bit last week, but I know you've written about it since. What does this mean for the prospect of Rand Paul 2016? The Post of the Union was kind of a pre-game skirmish between the Rubio and the Rand Paul forces. Rubio, relatively speaking, is going to be more in the communitarian camp because he's trying to forge the bipartisan compromise in immigration. Rand is the epitome of the rugged individualist, stingy. I mean, he wants to have the fastest path to a balanced budget, austerity be damned, effects of the economy be damned. Does this suggest that Rand Paul's got the upper hand here, despite the fact he's not taken it seriously, in establishment quarters?
I think, to continue the big word thing, Bill, I think that Paul is lucky that the conservative zeitgeist favors him today. So in a primary, I think that Paul's brand, his sort of libertarian-leaning Republican brand, is much more highly regarded today than it would have been in a different era. So I think that benefits him. The problem is, I think that in the general election, that the communitarian, compassionate conservative message plays much better, much more likely to attract soccer moms, much more likely to attract Hispanics, much more likely, I think, to attract undecided independent voters than the more you didn't build that 47% brand that I think Rand Paul represents. That's not a value judgment in terms of which one is right or wrong. But I think it's, Paul is lucky in the primary that his ideology is much more popular today than it used to be, say, 10 years ago. Although his is actually an old right ideology, not to confuse things. Rubio's is like, is much more popular, I think, in a general election. But what do you think, Bill? Am I wrong about this?
Well, I mean, I'm sort of I'll be on the Rand bandwagon right now. I feel like he's got. I think he's closer to the zeitgeist. I mean, things could look differently, 2 years from now. But I feel like the right is the right is more debt obsessed than they are immigration obsessed. so not pro immigration obsessed the way Rubio is. Rubio is doing the right thing to position himself for a general election. Rand's doing the right thing to position himself for a primary. I mean, it's going to be hard to get better positioned for a primary than Rand saying, I'm going to balance the budget in 5 years, and no one's going to touch him on that. And so I thought your column about Obama's leak on the immigration front, leaking a go-it-alone plan if there was no bipartisan bill, that would be much more aggressive in its path to citizenship. You were suggesting that maybe this is good for Rubio if the whole thing falls apart, and you can blame Obama as the person who introduced the poison pill, and Rubio somebody who tried to fix it sincerely but was bedeviled by Obama's Machiavellian ways. I mean, is that a better outcome for Rubio than actually having a bill he has to explain to a Republican primary electorate?
Good point. Let me just quickly close the loop on Paul. I think Paul's going to have a tougher time than people think because he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. He's trying to be this sort of, he wants to keep the Ron Paul people but win over mainstream conservatives some and put together a coalition. Much tougher than you might think. It seems like an easy two-step, but read my column at the week, and you'll find out why it's a little bit more dangerous.
Oh, I agree that it's hard, but I mean, any winning presidential nominee finds their way to have his cake and eat it too. I mean, you're always putting together some kind of coalition.
But I think Rand's problem is uniquely difficult, because it's an untenable, it's a potentially untenable coalition. It's almost more like a Rubik's Cube where you turn one thing to make this side match up and you F up the other side. So, I mean, I agree with you. Everybody has to cobble together a coalition, but I think the task is harder for Rand, and it's not appreciated to the extent it should be. But
so back to Rubio.
But to answer your question about Rubio, I think what was your question about Rubio? I forgot.
Well, is it better for Rubio if the process breaks down and you try to blame Obama for breaking it down because he leaked this plan that had a more aggressive citizenship path than Republicans are willing to swallow?
Right, good point. Well, there's like 3 conspiracy theories out there. Not conspiracy theories. One of them's a conspiracy theory. There's one theory that Obama is better off if nothing happens. And he is trying to insert a poison pill like he did in 2007 when he publicly supported immigration reform, but then supported Byron Dorgan's amendment, which inserted a poison pill, which I think was to get rid of the guest worker program, which caused the whole thing to fall apart. So Obama bears responsibility for immigration reform not happening in 2007. The Rubio people want you to know that. And it's unclear whether that's because they're afraid Obama is going to mess this up, or I want to say it's my theory, but look, I'll put it to you this way. It may be that the best thing that could happen for Rubio is for Obama to mess this up. Because then Rubio gets credit for having tried to have comprehensive immigration reform. That helps him with people who actually want to get this done. But then he gets to blame Obama, which will please the base. And because it didn't happen, the base won't be as mad at it. Some in the base don't want immigration reform. They'd be mad at him if it happened. But if it falls apart and he can blame Obama because Obama wasn't going to be tough enough on the security, that's really a win-win. Then Rubio could potentially run for president saying, only Nixon can go to China. Only I can get immigration reform done in a responsible manner that actually secures the border. So you must elect me president. Interestingly, there's a third theory, which is to say that Obama was doing Rubio a favor by leaking this out, providing him cover, and that Obama and Rubio both actually want to pass immigration reform, and this is helpful to that cause. So there's a lot of theories out there, and a lot of cynicism and skepticism. Bill, which of the three do you buy? What do you think is true?
Well, I think it's true that it's in Rubio's interest, I think, for it to fall apart and to blame Obama. I'm quite sure he would not mind that as an outcome personally, for his personal political ambition. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's all he cares about.
Right. Me neither. He very well may want it to happen, but he also could get lucky and make a lot of lemonade out of that lemon if it falls apart.
Right. But I don't believe it is in Obama's interest to have it fall apart. I don't think the leak was designed to be a poison pill situation. I mean, I think Obama from day one, the first term, has always been about accomplishments. He's never been about saving the issue. He has repeatedly, cut the deals to say, I did this. And if you're going to do that in your first term, for your election, you really want to do it in your second term to cap off your legacy. No history book's going to write about the great attempt you made to pass something and have it fall apart. So I think he has the interest in cutting the deal. But whether or not there is some report, it's just the leak was inadvertent, but obviously an inadvertent leak could really be deep down to be intentional. You don't really know, but it's in line with what he has said in the past, in the recent past, which is if you guys don't do this in Congress, I'm going to produce a bill and embarrass you if you don't vote on it. He's always been waving that cudgel around. So this just seems to be an extension of that. I don't take it as an attempt to sabotage the process. He's trying to creatively put pressure on the process so it doesn't stall out on the presumption that these things have limited windows of opportunity. And the fact that he followed up the leak with calls to Rubio and McCain and Graham saying, hey, guys, I still want to do this, suggests to me he still wants to do this. And I do think at the end of the day, if Rubio didn't want to do this, he wouldn't be putting himself out there. I mean, I think there are risks involved for him.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure he's aware of those risks. But, I mean,
you could argue that Obama and Rubio both benefit from an accomplishment, like being part of a landmark accomplishment. Obama would benefit, obviously. He's putting points on the scoreboard. That's his legacy. Rubio, that gives him... He's running. He would be running for president as someone who's actually gotten something done, something big done in the Senate.
And if this was the Obama Rubio bill or the Schumer Rubio bill or whatever, if his name's on the legislation or he's associated with the legislation, even if he doesn't become president, if he is seen as the leader that brought Latinos back to the Republican Party, at least made them competitive in the Latino community again, like that in and of itself is a major accomplishment for him. That's more than what most senators get to accomplish.
Right.
So I have to think he has that in the back of his mind. Like, I have a chance to do something historic for my party that I could, feel good about.
On the other hand, so I think that if I don't necessarily adhere to this strategy, but the notion that Obama would want to ruin this isn't absurd. So, number one, Obama would be depriving Republicans from getting credit, and depriving Rubio from getting credit, which would potentially hurt Rubio and make it less likely he would be president. Obama could benefit, his legacy could benefit by being a third-term president in a sense, having another Democrat succeed him. So he could deprive Rubio of this, deprive the Republican Party of this accomplishment, and keep the issues stirred up. Keep Hispanics mad at Republicans and angry and sort of. I mean, so it's not absurd to think that there is a political calculation whereby Obama and the Democrats benefit by nothing happening.
I mean, I see the theory, but Obama really had a big problem in 2012 that he didn't get immigration reform passed. When I would think very objectively, you could really say it was not his fault. I think that was not going to happen with the current Congress as it was situated. But he was getting the blame, and if it wasn't for that executive order that he did, he might have had a lot more bleeding in the base. I mean, I think the patience of the Latino community is pretty thin. I don't think they're going to accept a lot of excuses of inaction when there's so much expectation for action right now. So they could try to play that game, but again, I don't think it's in Obama's DNA. I don't think it makes a lot of political sense to try to play a blame game again when this was sold as, you elect me, this is going to get done. Republicans have made enough olive branches to suggest it could get done. I mean, you could very easily argue in 2010, 2011, these guys were just not going to do it. There was no way. You can't make that argument now. They're showing the interest in doing it. So which is why I think it's going to get done. I think they're going to find a way. So I see the theory that can be created around the idea of gridlock and blame game, but it doesn't add up to me.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see, and obviously there's so much bad faith that everybody is suspecting everyone has the worst motives, and there are literally theories that are in both cases view everybody negatively, but in opposite. Obama wants it, secretly wants it. Obama secretly doesn't want it. Rubio secretly doesn't want it. Rubio's better off with it, whatever. It's
if there's things you don't want and you're the president, you don't talk about it. He doesn't have to talk about anything. He sets the agenda. If you don't want it, don't put it on the agenda. So
I don't want to sound crazy, but you want people to think you want it, and then you've been cheated out of it and keeping people angry.
There are a lot of people in this country that want jobs. But Obama doesn't talk about jobs a lot. I mean, it doesn't come up at all. But there's no big jobs program out there. There's no big public works agenda that he has on the table right now. He's talking about guns and immigration and budgets primarily.
Right. Well, he didn't talk about Benghazi much either. I mean, I think you're right that he basically, if there's something he doesn't, and he acts, if he doesn't want to talk about it, if he doesn't want the media to think it's a big deal, he acts like it's not a big deal. So that, I think that's what he did with Benghazi. He sort of acted like it wasn't that big of a deal, which outraged a lot of people, but the press takes their cues sometimes from him. And so, which brings us to another story, the Tiger Woods golfing story. I don't want to talk about this too much. The only people I have less sympathy for than Obama is the White House press corps. And the fact that they didn't support Neil Monroe when he dared ask the president the question. But now they're somehow offended at the fact that they can't have a photo op with Tiger Woods. I have no sympathy for that. Just me?
Well, there was a swipe from Politico to Ed Henry. Ed Henry's the head of the White House press corps now, who was at CNN, now is at Fox News, who made this a prominent controversy. Politico suggested maybe he bet on the wrong horse here. That this wasn't the issue to take the stand on, to take the transparency stand on, because most people feel like a president can have a modicum of private time on a vacation on a weekend. That's not the biggest deal in the world. I could see an argument to say you could. Maybe he said he's on vacation. Maybe he said he's on golf with Tiger Woods, but I don't know. Maybe there's some secret backroom deal going on I don't know about because I'm not physically on the golf course. Again, you can have that conspiracy theory if you want to.
FDR pretended to be on vacation. He met with Churchill.
Right. I think there are examples of times like that where dealings do get discussed. Look, we don't have an open meeting law federally. No, in my town, Northampton, there's open meeting law. You can't have a meeting that's not publicly announced. The city councilors can't meet together. If you're not a quorum, they can't talk to each other. They can't have group emails because it violates the law. There's no federal law like that. You're allowed to have a private meeting. So, and it's not, and most people accept there's a certain amount of privacy that goes on at the presidential level. That you don't get to have the C-SPAN camera literally everywhere you go. So unless you can make the case that that's not right, that we should have that level of transparency, but I don't think that's the common perception.
Here's why it bothers me. When President Obama, we talked about earlier, this executive order, or whatever it was, for the Dreamers, Neil Monroe of the Daily Caller interrupted the president and asked him a question. It was probably rude, but what's this saying about like polite women don't make history? I think you could say the same thing about reporters. I mean, we don't pay reporters to be polite. I mean, they ask tough questions, and it was a very substantive question. How's this going to impact the economy? You've got this high unemployment rate. Now you're going to sort of make legal immigrants. Could that impact the economy? President did not make himself available for questions. Wasn't going to make himself available for questions. Was essentially using the press as a prop. And I didn't see the press corps coming to Neil's defense and saying, well, they could have said, well, maybe the timing was inopportune, but the president should answer that question. It's a substantive question. He should make himself. No, they didn't do that. They didn't come to Neil's defense. And now we're upset. They didn't get a photo op with Tiger Woods. I mean, I have no sympathy for them. None at all. And if they think that the public is going to rally to their defense, then they are smoking something. Because it ain't happening. It's not going to happen.
Well, I guess, I assume that I assume that the issue with the Monroe question was, I mean, they want access. They all want access. Right. They want to be able to ask the president questions as much as they possibly can. I think they legitimately felt that if you go to an event, a Rose Garden announcement, where you are told in advance the president's not going to take questions, and if you don't like that, you don't have to show up. You come to the event knowing that is the ground rules of the event. And you go there and you violate those ground rules, that's going to make the president less likely to make him available for further questioning. That's going to poison the precedence of their relationship.
It's an appeasement strategy, Bill. It's appeasement.
Well,
they're an abused spouse. They're an abused spouse that what was it Churchill said? It's what they did is Churchill's definition of appeasement is feeding an alligator hoping he eats you last. I mean, the president doesn't make himself available. He doesn't take questions. Well, and they could have.
I would personally argue that I would say that's an overstatement. But I know that is the perception that the.
I mean, if you are, I will admit, if you're The View or Rolling Stone magazine, he will be available to you. But
he does a lot of national TV interviews. He does a lot of local TV interviews. He does a lot of town halls. What he doesn't do, and he does some press conferences, maybe not as many as some others, but I don't think George Bush was particularly liberal with his use of press conferences either. I mean, there is an overall trend here of press management that it's not brand new with Obama. It's more, I think, just sort of an acceptance of how modern media operates and what is the best way to get your messages out. I don't think it's fair to say that he is somehow a closer individual that no one gets to ask questions to. He does not do as much of the traditional back and forth of the White House press corps than some others have done. I mean, although Reagan was always very famous for pretending not to be able to hear a question coming off the helicopter. So again, this is not all that new a situation.
But I think Sam Donaldson was a respected, revered figure for yelling questions that he wasn't supposed to.
I don't think conservatives in his day felt that way about Sam Donaldson.
But I think his colleagues,
a brutally obnoxious liberal hack.
No, but you're right. But his colleagues in the press corps would have defended him for asking questions when he wasn't supposed to. They don't do that. They didn't do that. So I have no sympathy for the.
Well, I think the difference here from the White House's press corps vantage point, from my understanding of it, is what Obama did on the golf vacation was some sort of break of precedent, that usually someone would be allowed on the golf course. There'd be some press pull, maybe at a certain distance. Maybe they wouldn't get up close camera shot or something, but someone would feel to physically be there to see that it actually happened. And that press was broken, that's bad. Whereas what Monroe did, Monroe's one breaking precedent in that case. So I think internally there's an intellectual consistency with where they're at.
Well, that may be true in terms of protocol, and I don't want to beat a dead horse, but Neil asked the question on the day that the president unilaterally decided a policy, which, by the way, a policy I agree with, but the president unilaterally decided something that was a very substantive, big deal. And Neil's question was about the impact that would have on the economy. Contrast that with the press being upset that they didn't get a picture of Tiger Woods. That's the problem with the press. That sums up the problem. It's I don't know.
Well, I'll leave it on that note. I have to jump for a meeting, unfortunately, but it's always good to talk to you, Mr. Lewis.
Good talking to you, and I need to come to Southampton sometime, because it sounds like a lovely place to visit.
It is. You'll see what took Calvin Coolidge's heart.
All right, man. Until next time.
Take care.
The DMZ.